Eleanor Hayes pressed her father's journal against her chest and walked straight into Combs Feed and Seed, where 5 men had just finished laughing at the idea of her. She did not lower her eyes. She set the bank notice flat on the counter where everyone could read it. 90 days, full balance, or forfeit. And she said quietly, "Tell me where I can find 20 mules nobody wants." The room went still. Then somebody laughed again. She was already walking out the door. If this story moves you, stay until the end. There's a reason this town still talks about what she did. The summer of 1886 came down on Millbrook, Tennessee like a fist. By the second week of July, the creek had dropped 4 inches, and the red clay on Hollow Road had cracked into a fine dust that rose behind every wagon wheel like smoke. Men leaned in the shade outside Combs' store and argued about a rain that wasn't coming. Women fanned themselves on porches and spoke low about which farms were already behind on their notes. Nobody said the name Hayes Farm out loud. They didn't need to. The silence around it said enough. Eleanor Hayes was 34 years old, and she had been a widow for 8 months. Her father, Thomas Hayes, not her husband, though half the county still got that detail wrong, had died the previous November, 2 days after the first hard frost, sitting in the chair by the kitchen window with his boots still laced. The doctor said his heart simply stopped. Eleanor believed it had been stopping for years, slowly, ever since the bottomland past the orchard flooded and never came back right. Ever since the drainage failed and 40 good acres turned into a black swallowing mess that broke plow blades and drowned the corn before it could tassel. Thomas had watched that ground die a little more each season. Eleanor had watched him watch it. Now she was the one left standing at the fence line. She stood there on the morning of July 9th, before the heat rose thick enough to bend the air, and looked at what the whole county called Bitter Hollow. The grass was coarse and the wrong shade of green, the kind that only grows where water sits underneath and never leaves. An old harrow lay half swallowed near the tree line. You couldn't see the water from the surface, but Eleanor could feel it, a weight in the air that didn't match the drought baking everything else around it. She had her father's journal in her apron pocket. She'd carried it everywhere since March, the way some women carry grief in a locket. She heard Mr. Holloway's horse before she heard him speak. A clean, well-shod animal on dry ground makes a particular sound, crisp, deliberate, the sound of money that has never had to hurry. Holloway rode a tall bay gelding and wore his good suit even out here, even in the heat. And Eleanor had decided a long time ago that this wasn't vanity, it was a message. The suit said, "I do not sweat for anything. Things come to me." "Mrs. Hayes," he said, drawing up beside her. "Mr. Holloway." She didn't turn. He looked out at the same dead field she was looking at. "90 days is generous," he said. "Most notes in default we call in 60. "I'm aware. The board was sympathetic, given your father's long history with the bank." He let that sit a moment, the way men like him let things sit. "I do hope you find a path forward, Mrs. Hayes." How much of the south pasture would clear the note? He smiled, and the smile didn't reach his eyes. The south pasture alone wouldn't satisfy it. You'd need the pasture, the barn, the spring rights, and the hollow itself. That's the whole farm. "Yes," he said simply, "it is." He clicked his tongue and turned the bay back toward the road. Eleanor watched until the sound of hooves faded into the heat shimmer. Then she opened the journal to the page she'd read so many times the spine had begun to soften there. Her father's small, careful handwriting. Drain line from Crow Ridge to the creek bend. Junctions blocked, not broken. The hollow is not dead, only waiting. Water doesn't disappear. It only needs to be told where to go. She read it 3 times. Then she looked back at the 40 drowned acres, and an idea moved through her. The kind of idea that sounds wrong the moment you say it out loud. The kind that empties a room of patience and fills it with laughter. She had learned growing up under Thomas Hayes to be suspicious of ideas that felt safe. Safe ideas were the ones that had already failed somebody else first. She needed mules, not 2 or 3, 20. Walter Combs was not a cruel man, and Eleanor had decided years ago to keep believing that, even on the days it cost her something. He was small in the particular way of a man who had never been wrong about anything that mattered to him, who had never lost something he couldn't afford to lose. He knew every farm in the county, every debt, every bad season, every marriage gone quiet at the edges, and he held that knowledge the way a man holds a good hand of cards, patiently, waiting to see who needed what. He was behind the counter at 7:30 that morning. 2 other men stood near the window. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, setting down his ledger, "what can I do for you?" "I need to know who's got mules they can't use. 20 head. I don't care about age, I don't care about temperament, I don't care what's wrong with them so long as the legs are sound." Combs stared at her. One of the men at the window turned around fully now. 20 mules, Combs repeated. "Yes. You know what your note with Holloway's Bank looks like, Eleanor. I run your account here, too. I know what you've got and what you don't. Then you know I'm not asking for credit. I have enough to buy the animals outright. What I need are names." "For what?" the man at the window said, not unkindly, just baffled. "What's a farm your size with no hired hands left and a drought on top of it going to do with 20 mules?" "Put them on the hollow," Eleanor said. Nobody spoke. Then Combs laughed, short, not unkind either, just the sound a man makes when something doesn't fit anywhere in his head. "The hollow has been dead 8 years. 3 men before your father gave up on draining it. Nobody can fix that ground." "Nobody's tried what I'm going to try," Eleanor said. "I'm not asking your opinion, Walter. I'm asking for names." He looked at her the long way a man looks at someone he feels sorry for and doesn't know how to say it kindly. Then he sighed and pulled out the ledger he kept on debts owed across the county. Silas Cobb, out past Crow Ridge, had 6 mules he couldn't feed through the dry months. He said the widow Pruitt had 4 she'd been trying to sell since spring because nobody wanted old stock. A trader had come through 2 weeks back with a string of culls nobody would take off his hands. Bad gaits, bad tempers, one with a twisted hind foot he was practically giving away. Eleanor wrote every name down in the back of her father's journal. It took her 11 days and nearly every dollar she had left to gather them. She bought mules other farmers wouldn't look at twice, an old gray Ginny with cataracts clouding one eye, a young mule with a crooked back leg the trader called Patch because of the scarred white mark over his hip, a pair of stubborn brothers nobody could get to pull together. She bought a lead mule last, a calm, steady-eyed animal from a preacher's widow 2 counties over, and she named her Juniper because her father had once said that was the name of the only tree tough enough to grow where nothing else would. People watched her bring them home 1 and 2 at a time down the dusty stretch of hollow road, and the watching had a particular shape to it. Not curiosity exactly, more like the slow gathering of an audience before something falls down. That was where Jonas Webb found her, 3 days into clearing brush at the hollow's edge. He was an old man who once worked Thomas Hayes' land before his hands gave out on heavy labor, and he carried a forked willow rod the way some men carry a Bible, out of habit, out of something close to faith. He'd been a water diviner before the war and after it, and most people in Millbrook treated that the way they treated fortune tellers, with a polite distance. "Your daddy talked about this ground for 20 years, Jonas said, watching her drag a fallen branch clear with Juniper's harness. "Always said the water wasn't gone, just turned the wrong way. That's what the journal says, too. You believe it?" Eleanor looked at the black, waiting earth in front of her. "I believe my father didn't write things down unless he meant them." Jonas walked the willow rod slow across the hollow that afternoon, and where it dipped hard twice in a long curving line toward the creek bend, Eleanor drove a stake. By evening, she had a line of stakes running through 40 acres like a seam stitched into torn cloth, and she stood at the end of it with dirt under her nails and her father's handwriting glowing faint in her memory. Tell it where to go. The work nearly broke her before it healed anything. The mules pulled a sled rig she and Jonas built from old fence rails, dragging clay tile up from the bottomland where her father had buried a length of it decades before and never finished laying. Patch, the mule with the crooked leg, turned out to have the steadiest gait of the whole string on uneven ground, picking his way over root and stone like he could feel exactly where the earth gave way beneath him. Juniper learned the line of stakes within a week and began walking it without being led, as though she too understood there was a destination, even if she couldn't have named it. Twice that August, Eleanor sat by lamplight with blistered hands and counted what was left of her money and came up short of what the work would need, and twice she nearly walked back into Holloway's office to ask if there was some other arrangement, some smaller defeat she could accept instead of the whole one. Both times she opened the journal instead and read the same 3 lines until her hand stopped shaking. The hollow is not dead, only waiting. Word moves slow and then all at once in a small place. By September, people drove the long way past the Hayes farm just to see what foolishness was still going on out there. Holloway came once himself, sitting his bay horse at the fence line in his good suit, watching 20 mules drag clay kyle through black mud while a widow walked behind them with mud to her elbows. "You understand," he said, not unkindly this time, "that even if this works, the harvest is gone for the year. You'll have cleared land and no crop to show your banknote." "I understand the note comes due in November," Eleanor said. "I understand the hollow doesn't have to feed me this year. It has to be alive by spring." He didn't have an answer for that, and he rode off without one. The first real sign came in the second week of September, after 3 days of rain finally broke the drought. Rain that would have drowned the old hollow completely, turned it back into the black standing mess it had been for 8 years. Instead, Eleanor walked out at dawn and found the new drain line running clear and full toward the creek bend, the water moving the direction her father had drawn for it 60 years before, in handwriting she now knew better than her own. The ground that had swallowed tools and broken axles for a decade stood damp but solid under her boots, walkable, alive. She stood there a long time. Then she put her hand against Juniper's neck and didn't say anything at all, because some moments don't need words, only a body standing still long enough to let them land. By late October, the first green came up across the hollow in patches, not a crop yet, just clover and wild grass finding root in soil that hadn't held anything living in 8 years. It wasn't enough to harvest. It was enough to prove her father right. She walked into Holloway's office on the 88th day with a different kind of proof than money, a signed agreement from 3 neighboring farms to lease the recovered hollow ground for spring planting, payment in advance, secured against next year's crop. It wasn't the full note. It was close enough, combined with what little she had left, and it was backed by something Holloway's bank had never seen from her before, a piece of dead land that wasn't dead anymore, with 20 mules standing in it who had nowhere else to be and nothing left to prove. He looked at the papers for a long time. Then he looked out the window at the mules, visible even from town, grazing on green that shouldn't have existed 3 months earlier. He signed the extension. Spring came, and with it the corn went into ground that had failed 3 men before her and 1 stubborn woman after them. By July, the stalks stood chest-high across what the whole county had called Bitter Hollow for a generation, and people who had laughed in Combs' store the year before now drove the long way past the Hayes farm for an entirely different reason. At the harvest gathering that fall, Margaret Holt, a woman about Eleanor's age, working her own flooded acreage alone since her husband passed, found her near the wagons and didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Combs said you might talk to me about my east field," she said. "Everybody tells me it's low ground, not worth fighting." "Does it flood?" Eleanor asked. "Or does it just stay wet after it floods?" Margaret blinked. "What's the difference?" "Everything," Eleanor said. "Flooding is water coming in. Staying wet is water that doesn't know how to leave. Those are two different problems, and only one of them is hopeless." Margaret's breath went out of her slow, the way it does when someone finally says the thing you'd stopped letting yourself hope was true. "Bring me your husband's notes if he kept any, and tell me, do you have mules?" "2, old ones." "Good. Old ones know how to read ground better than young ones ever will." That evening, Eleanor drove home in the long orange light with Jonas beside her and the mules moving easy in the traces, Juniper at the lead, Patch keeping his careful, steady pace over the road he now knew as well as any animal alive. She thought about her father, 22 years old once, laying tile across that same ground 60 years before, not knowing if it would ever matter, not knowing a daughter he hadn't yet had would finish what he started on a summer he couldn't have imagined. She didn't know if he believed it would work. She thought, watching the green hollow come into view past the fence line, that maybe believing wasn't the part that mattered. The trying was. She climbed down in the yard that night, opened the journal to the last written page, and beneath her father's faded words, she added a line of her own. "The hollow is open. The water found its way. The mules nobody wanted carried us there." She closed the book and sat a moment longer on the porch step, listening to 20 animals settle for the night in a field that had been given up on by everyone except 2 people, one living and one not, who had never stopped believing that what looks worthless is usually just something nobody has learned to see yet. This is a story about what gets called broken simply because no one stayed long enough to understand it. Land, animals, and sometimes people too. It's a reminder that the things written off as worthless are often only waiting for someone patient enough to ask, not "is this finished?" but "what does this still need?"